let you know that the podcast, our Quality Matters podcast, which you can find most anywhere you listen to podcasts, we are seeking sponsors for new podcast series, new live stream series. So if your sales and marketing team is perhaps looking to spend some of the budget that would have been spent on conferences this year, you're looking to get your name out there, let us know. We likely have a future podcast series lined up that'll be great for you and for your team to really get that message out there in a much more constructive manner than what you might have even gotten with conferences in the past. But enough of all of that. Let's jump into our QMS Bootcamp this week. So this is session 4 of implementing a quality management system. So this is the last part of the implementing a quality management system. And we're going to do a quick review before we dive into it here. Some of the key ideas that we really need to make sure that we don't forget and that we keep with us as we move forward. So up to this point, everything has been the foundational structure we need for implementing a management system. So now we're going to get into what it actually looks like in a 3-phased approach to implementing this QMS. So the first thing that I want to say is we're going to talk about timelines vary depending on organization, depending on the level of support you have, and the amount of training that your team has. So if you hear me talk about a timeline, you're kind of like, well, this doesn't sound quite right for us. Maybe we could do it quicker. Maybe it would take longer. The answer is probably yes. So really, oftentimes it's unique to the organization. Bringing someone like Texas Quality Assurance in to assist with the implementation. We have proven structures and timelines that we can work with. You can offload a lot of that extra work to us. But implementing it on your own, again, timelines can vary, and that is absolutely fine because you're developing the management system for your team and your organization. And you're the only one that's really accountable to it there. So don't feel bad on that. So some things that we're going to review is a couple of very key points from the previous session. So if you've not checked out session 3, make sure you go check it out on YouTube. But a couple of ideas is we're going to talk about the integrative process approach, very, very critical, and process mapping. And again, very, very critical. Anyone that tunes into the podcast, these are 2 of my favorite topics to discuss because they're just absolutely critical to anything in a quality management system. Again, quality being an adjective there of the management system, whether the management system is for a quality assurance program, it's for health, safety, environmental, medical device, information systems, you name it, the same concepts apply everywhere. So this term, integrative process approach, it's based on the idea of integrative thinking, that we can hold maybe 2 opposing ideas at the same time to synthesize a third solution. So the idea is here that we're to build an effective QMS. This includes the consideration of numerous variables. Of course, we're going to talk about interested parties, customers, our employees, competitors, our capabilities, our competitors' capabilities, our cost structures, the evolution of the industry, which anyone in the industry in the energy industry right now can attest that this is a major concern. Regulatory environment, and these are just to name some of the requirements you're going to face. So how can we synthesize a good solution that can evolve over time from these diverse requirements? And you want to make sure that all of these variables are integrated into a cohesive solution. And it's not as difficult as it sounds there. And it's because we're going to work by mapping our processes. So when we go to a process map, we're going to identify our resources, our inputs, our requirements, our goals and objectives, what that vision of good is. What do we want to be in a year's time? Where do we want to be? So when we say mission accomplished with this process, we're doing good. What's that look like to you? Then we're going to go next and identify our outputs. What are the expected outputs? So if you have a vision of good, you already have the good start on those outputs. Maybe some of those outputs could be corrective actions to feed into another process, could be feeding into your training program, any number of things there. Maybe it can have a feedback loop into your sales process. Who knows? But great things to take a look at and consider. And now since we have that vision of good, and we know our expected outputs, we want to identify measures. How are we going to measure in 6 months or a year time to say we achieved our goal? We now have a good process. So these checks and measures are very, very, very critical. Once these 2 are defined, you'll find that the process itself and the process controls your procedures, your work instructions, your specifications, your drawings, your forms, all of these various bits of document and information almost seem to line themselves up into the results that you need for developing your process there. And once all of this is complete, you have a very well-developed, very robust process that is going to serve you and your team well for years to come. Now, that doesn't mean that it's written in stone. This is all a part of a continuous improvement cycle. So once you get process Rev 1 completed, fully expect to revise it and to revise it and to revise it. And that is absolutely okay, provided you have a good change management process in place so that you can track the change, why you changed it, what the approval was, and how to verify its effectiveness later. So again, kind of quick recap of what we need to know, the skills that we need to have ready once we get into actually implementing that management system. And this can be done in a 3-phase approach. So people have asked, well, Kyle, what's the definition of quality? Because if we're talking about implementing a quality management system, we really need to know, what does quality mean? So the simplest definition that I can give to quality is to say what you do and then to do what you say. And this encompasses the process approach. This encompasses our various requirements for this integrative process method. So you have to state what you're going to do, and then you have to verify that you've done what you said. And again, all of this is part of the plan, do, check, act cycle that we've talked about before. So in planning, we're stating what we're doing, the P of the PDCA cycle. The do is where we actually follow through with this process. Now, in the P stage, we probably should have done the process mapping and identified all of the requirements and outputs there. And then we go through the actual process itself. Then we perform checks against criteria that we've previously identified. And then we take action. That action can be to move forward to the next step, to go back to perform corrective action, scrap, rework, retrain, all sorts of different outputs can be taken in the act phase. But the PDCA cycle is at its simplest, is to say what you're going to do and then do what you say. So very, very important idea here that's used in information technology, this idea of agile software development. This is actually the foundation of much of the agile software development world, is this iterative cycle to where we can make improvements, take a step back, move back forward, take a step back, move back forward. So I emphasize this because the number one complaint that I have heard about implementing a quality management system, ISO 9001 certification, you name it, is that folks don't want to be tied down to a specific way of doing things. So if you're listening here, very little about a quality management system is tying you down to a particular way of doing things. In fact, it's going to ensure that you've got a lot of opportunity to work in various manners. So we have a 3-stage implementation. This is actually the process we utilize here with Texas Quality Assurance during our consultation. It's the same process I've utilized personally many times in the past. And phase 1, gap analysis and core development. So we'll talk a little bit about gap analysis. And we've talked about it a bit before, but the idea of the gap analysis is we're going to identify the common required processes for whatever our compliance standard is, whatever our customer requirements are, against those processes that we actually have in our organization. It's going to be the case that there's much overlap on some of these, and it's going to be the case that there's holes in some of them, and it's going to be the case that you've simply not documented anything at all that you need. One of the most common places we find in a gap assessment that folks have done no documentation, and really very little thought and formalization of the process, would be with communication. Communication is one of these things we don't always think about. And we've worked with organizations that communicate across a wide variety of platforms, whether it's we're dealing with customer communication, partners in a supply chain, utilizing tools like Slack and Teams and Zoom and all these different communication channels. So this is oftentimes a gap that we find in the gap assessment, is that there are certain assumed communication channels, but there's no documentation or controls to ensure that they're undertaken. I'll only use this as an example of things that you might identify in that gap assessment. Core development. So what that means is the actual documentation of all of the required documented information. So document information, we'll have a lesson later on about this, but documented information falls primarily in two categories. Category one of documented information are your documents, and category two are your records. So there's some older terms that aren't really utilized in the standards as much now as it was 15, 20 years ago, but the idea of controlled and uncontrolled documents, controlled and uncontrolled records. So we'll discuss those again, as I say, in a future video. But the short version of what you need to understand is that if we're going to call something a document, this means that it has an approved version. We don't deviate from that approved version without reapproving a new version or creating an alternate copy that is then approved. So, and yes, that approval version and date do need to be on the document itself so that it can be differentiated from other documents. If, on the other hand, you are developing this entirely digital, perhaps instead of procedures and forms that are on Word or Excel or PDF or documents, all of this was digitally in a web page where each page was a procedure or a printable form or electronic form. Even then, we still need to identify the current version of that procedure versus any other previous version, especially when it comes to audit time. These are very, very useful things to have ready. But we're going to go through this core development. And you do need to know that the core development that we're talking about here may encompass anywhere from 20, 30, upwards of 40 process procedures. In standard, there's about 25 to 30 process procedures that most organizations need to have. Now, again, I say most. I try to avoid talking too generically when possible. But if you're a CNC machine shop with 10 employees, or if you are a food producer, on the other hand, with 60 locations across 10 countries, your requirements are going to vary. But even at both ends of the extreme here, you're going to find that there are certain basic process procedures that must exist no matter what. So then once we've gone through the gap assessment, which will, again, identify our processes versus what we have. And from there, we're able to identify additional documentation that needs to be developed by following the process approach and mapping each process. Then we want to move into phase two. Phase two is what we call implementation and utilization. Phase two is going to be very, very heavily based on employee training, on review, revision, and input from your team. So phase one versus phase two are very, very different in scope. There is some overlap, but generally speaking, we move into phase two. We know that we've got the meat of our process. We know generally what we're going to do. 80 to 90% certainty that each of these documents is very close to the final version, if not in the final version, to move forward to our certification. So that is the third process here, is our closeout and certification. This is going to include your internal audit, your management review, your third-party certification, and then the follow-up of any findings that you might have had there. And so we'll discuss that in a bit more detail. So let's move on. We're going to talk about the gap assessment here. Give me just a moment. Gap assessment is an on-site assessment. Now, this can, if you utilize consultants such as Texas Quality Assurance, this can be conducted remotely, but we do need to have a dedicated time set aside for it. And if you're wondering, well, how much time do we really need for a proper gap assessment? Realistically, if it cannot be done within a day, there are probably some more fundamental issues that need to be resolved ahead of time. So the gap assessment, your consultant or you as the quality manager should come in with a set of predefined processes that you know that you're going to review against. Now, if you want a little bit more information here, I'll be happy to send you personally a copy of a quick gap assessment tool that we've utilized and some checklists that we've utilized. So feel free to comment below or shoot me an email. You can find me on LinkedIn, so forth, if you want some information there. But some of these processes, let's talk about those for a minute. Let's see here. And there we go. So let's talk about some of the standard processes that we're going to be looking at. All right, let's see if I can get out of the way here. So some of the standard process we're going to be looking at. So what are we talking about here if we're talking about standard processes? These are going to be processes that are in place, any organization, almost regardless of your industry or service that you're in. So for one, we've already addressed. We've got our documented information. Critical process, everyone's going to have. We have to control what our required documentation is from our process procedures, our records, our work instructions, our drawings, you name it. So very, very critical process. Some would argue from a quality management and audit perspective, documented information may be the most critical process. Some would disagree, but we'll get there. Another one, and this one's going to be actually a little more hard to discuss and to evaluate, is we're going to talk about our leadership process. If you notice in the graphic we have here on the PowerPoint, leadership and worker participation is at the absolute center of the process. This is the same as it is with the standard graphics ISO 9001 has. And these graphics are developed this way for a very good reason, because it is absolutely central and critical to any proper implementation. So then we're going to have things such as our planning processes. Planning can have multiple avenues. So this could be our quality assurance planning. This could be our occupational health and safety planning. This could be our production planning. Any number of types of plans that we could be looking at here. So it's a lot to kind of keep in mind. All the way down to our performance evaluation, control of our external suppliers, you name it. So again, what you want to do is go through in a day's worth of time and identify the intended outputs, your inputs, create a process map for each one of these processes. Now, as you dig in deeper, especially once you start getting into your production environment, you may find that you have many, many more processes than you'd previously considered. So an example would be, say that you're a manufacturing facility. You likely have a weld shop, a machine shop, you've got a prep, possibly even coatings, inspection. So these are all subparts of that same production process. So let's begin with the uppermost level first. So for production planning, do you have a single planning process? Okay, maybe you have separate production meetings on a daily basis. Do they utilize the same ERP? Do they have the same requirements? Do these requirements come from the same sales group? So you're going to look at these things to identify, are these in fact the same process with different outputs? Or on the other hand, are these completely separate processes? So I'll give you an example for us here at Texas Quality Assurance. So we have our QMS software implementations. We have internal audits, consultation programs, training programs. So all of these actually fall under the exact same planning process for us. We have the same production planning process. We have different requirements for the varied outputs. But in the end, we identify tasks that need to be completed. We identify personnel to assign to those tasks, minimum requirements for success on those tasks, closeout, follow-up of each of the tasks. So really have a singular production planning process with varied outputs. And so I'm going to venture that for most of the folks listening to this, that your production process is not actually as complex as from a top level as you may initially perceive. So whether we're talking about welders, machinists, coders, inspectors, it's going to follow a similar production flow. They're likely going to use the same or similar job traveler. They're likely going to report to someone at the same hierarchy level in the organization. So really think about these things. And what's going to vary there is going to be a few of the outputs and the process controls that are utilized. So you may find that you have a series of 6, 7, 8 different procedures and 100 different inspection forms for your inspection team. Whereas on the other hand, for your welding team, you may have 5 or 6 different welding specs, some organizations, many more, that you're going to have to follow. Well, in the end, these are just additional process controls for the same process. So as you go through the process map, if you find at the end of the day, you have more than 30 processes that you've evaluated, we need to really consider, can we consolidate some of these together as the same process, but with varied outputs, depending on the particular process control utilized. So again, this is about a 1 day's worth of work. Now, you do not want to do this solo. So as you go, for instance, let's talk about the purchasing process. If we're talking about purchasing process, I don't work in accounting. I don't issue purchase orders. I probably need to go talk to the folks who do issue purchase orders, who do deal with the suppliers on a regular basis. Now, if I take them, my process map, and I ask them to fill this out for me, let me tell you, you're going to get rolled eyes, snarky comments, and a look of confusion, and as you should. So instead, you need to make it a conversation. Let the folks know, hey, we're here to review what requirements we need, don't need for this purchasing process. Can you tell me a little bit about your day? Okay, and this will tell you a few things, and then we're going to start getting into more of the meat of the issues. So let's use purchasing for a continuing example here. If you ask a person working in purchasing, tell me, how do you know what to issue a purchase order for? Well, we're identifying our inputs here, and we're identifying expected outputs here in a moment. And then they'll tell you, well, I get an email from so-and-so that they need to buy this. That could be an option. I get a purchase order request, and the purchase order request identifies the SKU, the description, and the price that someone else had agreed upon. Great. Maybe your organization is purchasing job to negotiate the price. That's an option as well. If you have an inventory management system in place, you may receive a tag or a ticket, whether electronic or paper or otherwise, to identify we need to reload our inventory requirements for this particular bin or this lot and so forth. So these are all options of varied inputs that you may receive. So then once you've gone through and you've identified all those inputs, reiterate, so this is what I'm seeing is you're getting your purchasing requirements here. We're identifying pricing requirements there. Do you have any cheat sheets or any documentation to show that that's what you do? And they may. Oftentimes, folks are really good at their job, have created their own cheat sheets to help them out. So definitely it's a great point to ask for a copy of it, that you would like to integrate that into a more formal procedure, and reemphasize to them that if changes need to be made, it's not a big deal. Changes can be made, reviewed, and approved, and we can keep moving forward. So now we've hit our inputs, we kind of know our outputs, and we have our process controls. And this whole process mapping might take anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes to complete. And then we're going to go to the next process. So you as a quality manager consultant, you're going to want to take a little bit of time up front to identify the processes, who we need to talk to for each one, and you'll really have a good shot in an efficient day. Now, when you're going through that process map cycle, let's move back a little bit here. The controls are controls for a process. These are going to be the requirements for the procedures, the policies, the forms that we either have or know we need to have. Now, at this stage, as you're developing your process maps, we're not too terribly critical about if that procedure has all of the detailed requirements necessary for 9001 or Q1 or AS9100 or whatever the standard might be. But we do want to make sure that we have a place to store our requirements so that we can state what we're going to do, so that we can later do what we said we would do. So the key output of your process map and gap assessment day is going to be an output of a list of procedures and forms identifying what you currently have or still need to have. In the case of purchasing, if we don't have anything to govern issuing of a purchase order, we likely need to have that in there. So once you finish with the gap assessment, with about a half a day's effort, you can compile this list, and you've created for yourself a checklist to then roll into the documented information development. Once you go into documented information development, there's a lot to it to take a look at, but the key piece of any procedure, if you've never written a procedure before, this is going to make it a lot easier for you. And we have templates available on the website. So if you'd like to go to texasqualityassurance.com, you can download several free, absolutely free templates online. So check those out, and that'll give you a little bit of the format that we're talking about here. But we always identify a procedure with a purpose statement. The very first part of a procedure should be purpose. Why does this procedure exist? If you cannot identify the purpose clearly, I can promise you it either does not need to exist as its own individual procedure, perhaps just a subsection elsewhere, or you're going to run in all sorts of squirrely rabbit trails later on down the road trying to complete this process procedure. The second piece to look at is your procedure needs to identify the scope. What are the bounds of this procedure? Purchasing is also a great example. So let's say that your organization does have a coatings division and a machining division and a fabrication division. So in your fabrication division, you're going to have very different set of materials that you're purchasing versus your coatings division. Coatings division, you may be outsourcing to various heat treat providers and so forth. So it is likely that you could have two very distinct purchasing processes. It is likely that you could have two subsets of the same purchasing process. So you want to make it clear to the person reading this procedure in 6 months or 5 years in the future, which part of our purchase process does this cover? It may be that it covers all purchasing within the organization. It may mean that this procedure, due to some complexity, only includes one subset of the organization. So you want to make this very, very clear. We've had some clients that when going for ISO 9001 certification or similar certification may have multiple locations, and each location has a very unique scope, and they want to get this location certified first, kind of perfect everything over here, and then extend out to the rest of the organization. So in doing so, we want to make sure that the documented scope of these procedures is such that they only govern this particular process at this particular location. That way it's not to be confused with anything anywhere else within the organization or the management system. Once you've completed with that, then we want to move into identifying any critical definitions. So words carry odd meaning to different people. For instance, here in this video, I've already qualified what we consider quality, a quality management system, what quality is. So you do want to take time to identify any critical definitions, any jargon that you use, so that any future person reading this procedure can immediately know what this does and does not mean. Then you want to move into identifying any additional critical references. So perhaps this is an overarching purchasing procedure, and you know that you've got 3 sub-procedures for very different branches of the organization. Well, do go ahead and list that you will be clarifying additional information in other procedures. Now, does this mean that you have to keep every procedure and every form up to date with every reference elsewhere? Not at all. But it does mean that if you reference your critical references up front in the procedure, the person reading it can know if they're not finding what they're looking for to go look elsewhere. And let me tell you as well, when you're going through an audit, this is a very, very valuable tool as well, because your auditor is going to look for information. And if he doesn't find it in that procedure, the assumption is you don't have it. So if you can make a reference elsewhere, you're going to save yourself a lot of time and a lot of effort. The last benefit of making these references is it allows you to keep your procedures short. You do not want a 20, 30 page long procedure as a general rule of thumb. If we can keep these procedures down to 3, not more than 5 or 6 pages, that's going to make it very, very easy for the next person to come in to review the requirements and move forward. So the last phase here is our certification and closeout. Certification and closeout. It's conducting your internal audit, your certification audit, your management review of any findings, and can be a very, very easy, can be a very, very difficult. Either way, a very good experience and great chance to learn. And again, we'll discuss that some more. So I'll make a note here about timelines for implementation varies, and it does. So at Texas Quality Assurance, we have a program for a 3-month implementation. It includes our team of consultants working very heavily with you on a weekly basis over a 3-month period of time to get your gap assessment completed, your documentation rewritten, revised, reviewed, and approved, and then training each of your team members on the varied requirements of it. Now, we have the advantage that we can do this in a period of time because it is something that we do day in and day out. The same way I might know how to weld, but let me tell you, I'm going to hire a professional welder to do it if I want it done quickly and I want it done in a cost-effective manner. I can go do it, but it's the same type thing. It may be that you want to conduct the implementation yourself, and that is absolutely fine. So we want to make sure we should get you some information here. But we may talk about 3 months for phase 1 and phase 2, whereas you may find that it's going to take you 6 to 12 months to get it done. That's okay, provided you have a plan so that you can then check against it to know how you're doing. So when we are rolling out the implementation of our management system, cannot overemphasize how important competence is. Now, competence is one of these terms that needs to be defined. Competence can be prior experience. Competence can be a certified training. Competence can be any number of things, but there's some ways that we can help define that. So we want to identify our job descriptions. So each of the people in your organization should have a job description. Now, if you're operating a small business, you may say, well, Kyle, I have 5 different hats I wear. How am I supposed to write a job description for myself? Well, I can tell you, I've been in that spot myself. At a previous company I worked at, I started out as the IT manager. That expanded to health and safety. Then that expanded to environmental, to quality, and then to inventory, not to mention any other weird ancillary tasks and activities I had. At one point with an ISO auditor, he was trying to pin down a good title for me. And he said, Kyle, you are the manager of all things not engineering. I was like, okay, well, that sounds kind of good. But what we actually did for me then, and what we have done for folks here at Texas Quality Assurance, is we'll say, great, what are your key job responsibilities? So, for instance, my old job responsibility, we had the IT manager. All right, so there's one job description that's written. And when I left the company, they filled that position. Then we had health and safety manager. That's one. We had quality manager. That's another. So then they were able to fill those positions with that job description. So if you are a small business, let's just imagine if you had 3 times the revenue that you have today, which, by the way, developing a QMS, going for certification, and the whole process is one of the best ways to do that. So let's imagine that you're 3 times the volume you are now, and you have to split these multiple jobs that you have among different people. Write the job descriptions accordingly. So another way that you can ensure proper competence to someone is to identify this in an employee orientation. So one of the first things we do in a consultation program is we get the entire team together, either by department or, for a small business, if your team of 20, 30, 50 employees, we'll just grab everyone together at once. And we're going to talk about the management system. We're going to talk about what we're doing here. We're going to get everyone introduced to what's happening. Then we're going to take some of the content of that initial training and integrate that into a future new employee orientation program. So that when someone comes into your team, they know who you are, what you're about, and what you're doing, and why you're doing it. Another way could be that we might have an on-the-job training program. Maybe there's a shadow program you have. Maybe you're waiting for someone to get the XYZ weld cert and training them up on it, whatever it is. But do document what those on-the-job training programs are. Then we're going to also have the option for training library. Perhaps you have a stock of health and safety trainings that have to be performed on a regular basis. So you want to make sure that those are documented as well. If you're outsourcing those to someone else, make sure that those requirements are outsourced as well. So just a lot of ways that we can go through to ensuring competence. But once we know the required competence and how we expect folks to achieve that competence, that goes a long ways in the implementation process to making sure that each people know exactly what is and isn't required for their job. And you'll find that competence requirements are almost always a requirement of each process as you go through your gap assessment. So We've got here for phase 2, an average company self-implementing. This is going to be about a 4 to 6 month process. Now, part of the reason that we list it, if you're doing self-implementation, as a 4 to 6 month process is that when you go to get certified, is that auditor needs to see on average about 4 to 6 months of quality records before they can certify you. We actually take this into account when we do our own consultation work here. So when we do a consultation project, we will have to postpone the internal audit until such time that the client has enough quality records so that a certifying auditor can come in and accurately conduct the audit, even if everything was implemented and put into place within that 3-month period of time. You do want to make sure that you develop a rolling monthly schedule to ensure appropriate support's provided. So what that means is, and you want to identify month by month by month. If you say that you're going to get this accomplished in 6 months, 9 months, whatever it might be, what are your goals for month 1? Have a dedicated time monthly to review. Did we achieve these goals? What else did we achieve? And what did we not achieve? Then you can review into month 2, 3, 4, and so on. How is this going to impact us down the road? Maybe you had a great month, you achieved more than you expected. How's it going to impact the rest of the schedule? Maybe you missed a couple of things. Again, you need to know how it's going to affect the rest of the schedule. We actually have, again, on the website, free download, a personal goals tracker. Great tool that can be utilized for tracking projects such as this as well. Then we want to go through the development and redevelopment of our trainings in accordance with our customer, internal, and ISO 9001 requirements. Now, you may be wondering, Kyle, why are you talking so much about training right now in implementation? And it's simple. If you're going to implement a system, you have to make sure that your employees are trained on the documented version of that system. So as you go through and write these procedures, hopefully these procedures were written and these forms or requirements were written with the input of your team. But one of the critical factors that you have to consider here is that the final product of that process procedure is oftentimes a culmination of knowledge and input from several people, oftentimes in diverse and different aspects of the company. So by reconducting a regular training on these procedures, on these processes, and what the expected outcomes and controls are, you ensure that everyone's together in alignment. And again, this is only going to make for a more effective, more efficient system moving forward. These trainings don't have to be long and lengthy. A 5-minute, 10-minute review of a procedure with a sign-in sheet can be absolutely enough for documentation-wise and, to further build that culture that you're really trying to implement. Then we want to talk about developing department-specific specifications. So we've addressed this a little bit, but these are also, what are your NDT specs? What are your weld specs? What are your manufacturing specs? This is going to get really into the weeds of your customer requirements, your production requirements. This is one of the last things that we actually worry about. And it's in the implementation phase that we really focus here, because in the initial gap assessment and development activities, we're developing the procedures that will then be used for the development of these technical specifications. So technical specifications, the fact is, if you're already conducting business, you have some sense and semblance of what those technical specifications are. Perhaps you're not codified or documented as well as they should, but I'm going to bet you money that you're not out there working, producing revenue, and adding value to your customers without already having a lot of this in place in some form or another. So again, when I talk about going through the gap assessment and the core development, it really is the core development. I stress this because it is so often that we see folks jump straight into the small, not unimportant, but smaller details about their production requirements and technical requirements. Not the first place to start, usually the last place to land to. It's a little different than what you might initially think, but trust me, it helps so much in a proper deployment of a quality management system if we can save some of the technical specifications and requirements for one of the last parts of our implementation of our system. So now let's talk about our closeout. Closeout, this can be about a 3-month process, and it's really hard to shorten it by any extreme measure. So let's talk about what Closeout is. Closeout is we have gone through the implementation phase. We have identified we have met the goals we achieved to meet. We've completed the trainings. We've reviewed the processes. We've revised documentation. We know that we're running on a quality management system. So now it's time to conduct an internal audit. Now we'll have future videos talking about internal auditing, the requirements for it, tips, tricks, all sorts of good information about internal auditing. But for now, we just need to know that on average, your internal audit is going to be anywhere from a single day to about 3 or 4 days for your internal audit for most small businesses. And the internal audit is going to assess in detail every aspect of your quality management system. Now, again, if you are a small business, you do need to be aware that if you self-audit, your internal auditors cannot audit a part of the company that they are responsible for. So this does mean that self-auditing for small businesses is oftentimes quite difficult. Again, this is a service we offer at Texas Quality Assurance. It is possible to self-audit a small business. I have been a part of conducting that before, but I did have to train up 5 additional folks to audit various aspects of the organization so that no one audited their own work or their own department. But once that audit schedule is completed, you want to make sure that you have a defined scope of which department we're auditing, and it's going to be on a sample basis. So you might, we'll use the purchasing example. You're not going to audit every single purchase order from the past 6 months. But let's say that there was, 100 purchase orders from the past 3 months. Well, you might decide to sample 10% of that. So you'd sample 10 purchase orders. Then you cross-reference those purchase orders against the requirements defined in your process procedure and make sure that everything lined up well. Cross-reference that against requirements of the standard. Move forward, identify any findings, and keep working. Findings are not your enemy in an audit. In fact, findings are one of your best friends because it is very difficult to find things in your own department. Having someone else with an outside eye that doesn't know that's how we do it, take a look, is hugely, hugely helpful. Then you want to conduct your management review. We get a lot of questions about management review. How do I structure it? What do I put in it? What do I talk about? Well, the ISO standard, I believe, don't quote me on it right now. I forget exactly how many letters there are, but when you go into the management review section of the ISO standard, it actually lists all of the requirements really, really nicely. And my suggestion to folks is that you take each one of these bullet points and set it as a title of a section for your management review report. And then simply fill in the missing details with information gathered from your internal audit. You want to do review any metrics, KPIs, numbers, customer satisfaction, all this different information, but it gives you a really good outline. So this is probably the one and only list of the ISO 9001 standard that you can take almost unedited and utilize in your day-to-day life. That management review needs to be completed after the internal audit because the internal audit is a huge input into the management review process itself. Then with that management review, you're going to outline some outputs from that review. Well, what are the corrective actions that we're creating as a result of the internal audit? Are there any additional corrective actions that we need to create before we move to our certification audit? Do we intend to move forward with certification? You want to note all of these things, and they should be documented in their own record and stored for future sake. Then you're going to move into your certification audit. If you've never been a part of a certification process, you'll find that it is generally, although there are some exceptions, sort of, that you're going to have what's called a stage 1 audit and a stage 2 audit. The stage 1 audit, generally speaking, is 1 day, maybe 2 days. And that stage 1 audit is conducted, and the stage 2 audit, are conducted by a certifying body. Now, that is a whole other fun topic to talk about. But if you have a consultant who's also saying they can certify you, run for the hills because you absolutely will be wasting your money there. Your certifying body cannot serve as your consultant. It's strictly forbidden. But folks do sometimes try to, unfortunately, sell poor services that they shouldn't sell. So your stage 1 audit is generally speaking, like I say, 1 to 2 business days. and it's largely a document review. Some people call the stage 1 audit a readiness review. And the idea is, are you actually ready to proceed with the full audit? Once that stage 1 audit is conducted, again, generally speaking, the certifying body will have about 6 months to schedule the stage 2 review. Again, generally speaking, that stage 2 audit is conducted within a month, if not back to back with the stage 1, but that has to be at the client request. And that stage 2 audit is very similar in structure to the internal audit that you've just gone through, except now it's going to be an external body who knows really nothing about your business or your organization. And they're going to roll through the audit and all of the various requirements of the standard, and to ensure that you're meeting requirements you've spelled out for yourselves in your process procedures. Once this is completed, they will have so many findings that you must close out. So yes, it does happen that there's a no finding audit, but it's really pretty rare. And unfortunately, a lot of auditors have a little bit of too much pride to have a no finding audit. So you'll likely leave the audit with a finding or two or more, and that's okay. And what you want to do is go ahead and write up corrective actions to say, this is my plan to close out this audit finding. Here's how I'll verify its effectiveness when it's done. And you submit that plan to the certifying body. They'll review it, get back with you if they need more. And then once that's completed, they'll issue your ISO 9001 certificate or whatever applicable standard you have. At that point, again, generally speaking, you'll have what's called a surveillance audit in the following year. And they'll audit about half of the aspects of your management system. The next year, another surveillance audit, auditing about half of those aspects. And then on the third year, it's a recertification audit, and it's as though you're going through the stage 2 audit all over again. And that's it. That's the closeout of your ISO 9001 process. All in all, this can be completed in as little as 3 months. If you're doing a self-implementation, expect this to last about 6 to 12 months to complete the entire process. But whatever the case may be, the difference that we see as we do our own research and go through our own sales process, organizations that do versus do not have a quality management system, it is a 10-fold difference in revenue of what they're able to do and what they can do and what they're actually doing with their business. And that is so incredibly important in today's times. So, it's understandable that folks have to put these programs on hold for financial reasons. But at the same time, we see very clearly a correlation here between organizations with the management system who are not only surviving, but thriving in these times versus organizations without that are struggling, if not have gone under. So during these very difficult times that we're in, do not neglect these quality management principles. If you're looking to get more information about quality management, about how you can make improvements, please let us know. I am happy to talk to anyone. If you can't tell listening to these, I love everything about quality and quality management, and we truly believe quality matters. That is not just a catchphrase and a buzzword. It is the reason we have the podcast. It is the reason that we have this business and do what we do. So please let us know if there's anything that we can do for you, any questions that you might have. We have no shortage of free resources available online, and I'll be happy to answer any question I can. So, thank you for being with us so far on the QMS Bootcamp here. We're going to be transitioning into discussing maintaining a management system, and we'll again have additional sessions talking about internal auditing, things like document control, and really getting into the details and weeds on a lot of these processes. So thank you again very much, and I hope to hear from you soon.